Hello, coffee and COVID fans, and welcome to the Frappy Hour, where we interview a pandemic-related newsmaker. Today, we're talking to Anthony Sabatini, who's been the District 32 Florida House Representative since 2018. We're very pleased and excited to have him here today, not least because Mr. Sabatini has been very involved in these pandemic-related issues since the beginning. In fact, Anthony, you and I are members of a very exclusive club of lawyers with a very narrow practice area, aren't we?
That's exactly right. There might be four of us in the state or five.
Yeah, and was it also your boyhood dream to grow up to be a lawyer who practiced mask litigation?
Well, more broadly, I would have defined it more broadly. I definitely did want to go to law school, not to make a lot of money, but to actually be able to say I was fighting for someone's constitutional rights, in the face of government overreach. And that's exactly what it was.
Why do you think that more lawyers didn't step up to take these cases in the beginning?
Well, I think, a lot of your viewers or listeners might have probably have a hunch, and a lot of people had a hunch going into by the middle of the pandemic that the legal profession has a really, really, really heavy political tilt to the left, and that first of all, you're just not going to find lawyers who are interested in challenging any government action that could be considered to be liberal, or for a good, liberal cause. And the lockdowns were seen as, for public health, public safety, and therefore, you know, uh, the Democrats wanted to see more centralized government control, government moves. And so I don't think any liberal attorney would have ever, even for a pretty penny, ever challenged. And of course, there was no money. I mean, there were some people who were willing to pay, but there was almost no money for the type and the extent of litigation that would be required to win any of these cases. There was very little money. So, so you got a very liberal profession that doesn't see dollar signs, and so they were just averse to doing it. So it ended up being the only people who were willing to take the cases were those who actually believed that what the government was doing was wrong. Individual mandates, putting people in jail, shutting down businesses, locking them in the homes, curfews, these sorts of things, were fundamentally wrong and worth challenging. And as you know, when you swear into the Florida bar, you take an oath to defend the Constitution. If there's government action that seems unconstitutional, you actually have not just the power, but the duty, the responsibility to challenge it. And so when people came to me or you or anyone saying, "Hey, I want to challenge this as an attorney," I think it's wrong to turn the case down.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll say, my case, and I don't know if you know this, but I recently, this week, we voluntarily dismissed it without prejudice because the local state of emergency ended here and it was moot. But we did survive this long since, whenever I filed it in May of 2020. So I got pretty deep in it, and we went up to the first DCA, and we went to oral arguments in November, and those the panel hasn't decided yet. So we filed a suggestion of mootness in that case. So it looks like the courts were, waiting to see if the governor was going to fix this problem for them. That would be my guess, and I wouldn't blame them for doing it. But on the other hand, we didn't lose either. So I'm encouraged by that. And I don't know if I mentioned this to you when we spoke yesterday, but I've I filed one lawsuit against the school board of Polk County,
Mhm.
and we've served a demand letter on Alachua County relating to masking the kids.
Nice,
Uh,
excellent.
yeah, what do you feel like you learned from all of your mask litigation?
A lot. I mean, I've had friends say you should write a story about it, write an article about it, long form article or piece about it. But I mean, from top down, there's so many insights, so many things to take away. I've learned a lot personally, but at the same time, I've definitely learned a lot about what's happening in our judiciary and what's happening, in politics. And one of the things that attracted me to doing the lawsuits were the long term implications of what happened, the normalization of all types of new government action in our lives. Telling somebody that they have to wear certain types of safety gear at all times outside their own home or even inside their own home, as we saw Key West and Broward try to do. The normalization of that type of government action is detrimental, because now really anything that has a 0.01% death rate, fatality rate, is going to yield all types of new government action, because why wouldn't they? At that point, it's irresponsible. They did it once, they need to be doing it more going forward. So the biggest takeaways, things I learned the most, is simply that you have to fight these things as often as you can wherever they pop up, because if not, the normalization is really scary. So the individual mandates, the lockdowns, I mean, just think about lockdowns. You never in all of US history have we ever locked down. We've never just told
Right.
everyone you have to lock these people in their homes, and if they leave, they can be arrested. And that dividing arbitrarily, most of our economy, which, as you know, is all intertwined, but dividing it arbitrarily to say this is essential versus not essential, in my opinion, was per se a violation of rational basis. There was no justification. In a complex, intertwined economy, you can't just tell people that, okay, these are the essential businesses, these aren't, when everyone's depending on each
Hmm.
other in a free market economy for everything to operate. So many of the things that happened were alarming and had to have been fought over. But there's just so much to talk about. We really should probably write a story about the whole thing.
Yeah, I'll be happy to work with you on that one. Did you hear in the news over the weekend that Dr. Fauci is now admitting that there might be, he's not sure, we have to look into it, but there might be a connection between that Wuhan lab and COVID after all.
Yeah. Yeah, he's I think obviously his back's against the wall at this point. It's just absurd to deny that the Wuhan lab didn't have some role to play in the outbreak of COVID. So now he's like you mentioned, kind of gently letting that narrative go forward and trying to get on the right side of it by saying, well, there's no evidence that they didn't. It's just him trying to get out of his position that he had, which was untenable, which is, he said at one point, it's the conspiracy theory. It's absurd to think that that lab had anything to do with the outbreak of COVID. So he's just trying to last another day. He wants to spend
Yeah,
another 20 years misguiding all of our responses to any pandemic going forward. So
he's a
very,
good bureaucrat.
yeah,
Yeah. Um, so a lot of people are starting to feel like the pandemic is winding up, and the CDC is now saying at least people who are vaccinated can take the masks off, and so that's people feel like, well, we've come a long way, and we're almost through this thing. But what do you see as the big liberty related issues that we still have to grapple with?
well, I think the most immediate and prevalent one, and this is why I refuse to applaud anything the state or executive branch is doing right now until it gets fixed. But the most immediate and apparent one is the children. We're literally telling children who are in the most important developmental moment of their lives, when they're interacting with other people and everything else, that they have to wear giant plastic devices attached to their face, or they'll be severely punished or even hit, like we saw a girl on a school bus last week,
Hmm.
literally hit if they're taking these masks off. And of course, these make it impossible for them to identify and react to emotional reactions of their peers and each other. They can't breathe freely. And also just more, unconsciously, and the fact that we're putting these harnesses on them, these restraining devices, psychologically has to make them, I think, impotent people. I think it does definitely play some role in making them just feel of themselves as victims or weak individuals psychologically going forward. So what's happening right now is disturbing and inhumane and completely wrong. And yeah, Florida is so-called the land of the free right now, but as long as we're treating all these children like animals, like cattle, and making them wear this, we should be ashamed of ourselves as a society. So I think that's the biggest thing that we need to fix, and that's very immediate. The governor's talking about getting rid of it in the summer, and made this like softly worded letter saying we're suggesting school boards to get rid of it in the fall, but that's just not the right answer. We should have never allowed it. There was no data to show significant spread or risk from COVID for children. It should have never happened. There should have never been masks. There should have never been school closures. The governor's already said there should have never been school closures. There should have never been a lockdown. He said he
Hmm.
regretted all those things, and we'll regret this too if we don't immediately issue an executive order to stop the masking of children. So that's right now. The next thing that's going to happen, I mean, you still have a ridiculous takings issue with these landlords, and this is still in a federal appellate court, but telling people that that they're allowed to live rent free in all these places that in many cases, especially here in Florida, these homes are second forms of income for senior citizens and
Hmm.
people in their retirement, and telling people that they're not going to have to pay rent for the extended periods of time is just wrong. That's something that we as lawyers need to be focused on, the cruise industry. But I'd say probably most important was the thing that was left out. After the masking of children, the single most important issue that we need to be focused on are employment protections for people who are basically being either coerced or unduly sort of incentivized to become vaccinated in both public and private employment. I wanted to see the so-called vaccine passport bill in Florida include employment protections. Instead, it was just consumer protection. So if you come into a Walmart, they can't say, hey, you have to be vaccinated before you walk in the front door. I'm glad we did that, but that was just one step in what would have been comprehensive COVID vaccine passport protections.
Hmm.
And the governor and the legislature decided to sidestep the employment issue. Um, and I think that disappointed a lot of people. I think it misled a lot of people. There were a lot of people who really believed that when they saw this vaccine passport legislation going forward, that they weren't going to be able to be punished or fired for not being vaccinated at their own place of employment. And
Hmm.
also that they weren't going to be mistreated, because what you're seeing now is employers saying, hey, there's now two categories at
Right.
work. You're vaccinated, you get an extra holiday, you get days off, you get a raise, you get this. And if not, you have to wear a sticker, or whatever, showing that, you're a danger to society, et cetera, and be segregated. And that's just wrong. But perfectly legal right now under law until we do something about it. So that's the next big battle.
Yeah, I'm getting calls from a lot of potential clients or people who would like me to represent them, although I don't have a lot to work with right now, who are in those employment situations. And you probably heard about Publix, right? That is allowing vaccinated employees to take their masks off, and the unvaccinated employees have to keep wearing the masks. And so right away that feels fundamentally unfair to people and creates two, levels of employees. So there's the better employees and the worse employees, right? And it's very discriminatory. But maybe worse than that is it discloses personal medical information to the entire world, right? Every customer that comes in there can see which employee is vaccinated and which employee isn't vaccinated. And maybe those people don't want other folks to know about it. Imagine if it was your STD history, right? And you had to wear something if you had ever had an STD or something like that. So I don't think that's hard to understand, but I've heard of cases now where employers are doing things like setting up portable toilets outside and requiring unvaccinated workers to use the portable toilets. They're not allowed to use the indoor toilets anymore, and creating just really unbearable working conditions through these, as you said, these coercive strategies designed to, put people in a situation where they really have no alternative but to go ahead and accept this medication that they don't want and don't feel like they need.
Yeah. It's scary, but like you mentioned, we don't have a lot to work with, but some case has to be brought forward, because you're talking about work conditions that uh, are just really mean spirited, and will have definitely going to have some kind of significant detrimental effect. But and obviously there's going to be a lot of employees with contracts that they already signed before they were employed, so maybe there might be some employee protections about changing the conditions of work. I mean, we gotta find something to work with here, because it's just wrong. But as you know, I mean, this could be handled so very easily politically, just by the governor issuing an order, the legislature putting forward protections saying, you can't fire someone for not being vaccinated. It's just wrong. And I wish we would have done that. But I think big business pushed back on that idea, because I guarantee that idea was at least floated for at some
Sure.
period during the session.
Yeah. So far, going back to your original point, both Texas and Iowa, I believe, have protected kids from these masks. I think Governor Abbott in Texas did it by executive order, and in Iowa, the legislature did it. So, what's holding Florida back from, we seem to be falling behind the bandwagon on this issue.
Yeah, no, we're not leading on it. We're definitely not leading on it. Most of the governors are doing a bad job, but as you mentioned, some are doing okay. Um, it's like any complex political issue. I'm not defending anyone here because I think I was king for a day. Like I said, it would have never occurred. But I think, the power of this teachers unions, uh, school boards that are pushing back, um, and then, just some in the Republican Party are still afraid of the media. They don't want to combat the COVID narrative all the time. They always tiptoe towards it, right? Like they're combating the false COVID narrative about everybody going to die, everyone's going to die, and everything's going to be destroyed. One tiny step at a time. And the truth of the matter is, we should have just taken a hammer to it from the beginning. We should have never locked down, never did school closures, no masks, no anything. And just like Sweden or anywhere else, we would have had these different metrics, better metrics, just like we have better, way better metrics now than California and all these other states that continue the lockdowns way longer and masks and everything else, and just defeated the COVID narrative that way. Instead, we did this incremental approach where it's like we just opened up earlier, we opened up our schools earlier, we did all these little things. And I think that's just wrong. And I think that what's happening with children's forced masking of children is another instance of that. It's like they don't want to just end it immediately like they should. Even in Texas, it won't even take effect till next week on June 4th. So it's like, why not do it? Because the truth of the matter is they understand that a lot of these politicians believe in the power of the COVID narrative, and they're afraid of it. And so they lack the courage to just take it out with one full swing, which is what they should have done. I mean, none of this should have ever happened. It's like we should have just continued marching on and said individual responsibility is going to reign and be key. And we didn't do that.
Well, one of the things that I find really interesting about what's happened are some of the unanticipated political effects. And I don't mean, and what I'm talking about are ones that are sort of moving the country in a more conservative direction at the grassroots level. And for examples, I would offer you the bill, SB 2006 that the governor signed a couple weeks ago that removes a lot of emergency authority from local jurisdictions, even from the governor's office. Right now, I can't really conceive of another way that could have happened without us going through something awful like this and learning our lesson. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the Chapter 252 in the Florida statutes, which gives the governor and the local political subdivisions enormous power, way more power than anybody would have imagined that they ever needed or were willing to use or misuse like they did this time, surprised a lot of people when it became used. A lot of people were shocked to know that a city or a county can do a lockdown, and have Christian pastors arrested and come up with essential versus non-essential businesses and all this. It just seemed like way, way, way too much power. So Senate Bill 2006, which passed, was a positive step, and I'm optimistic. But the truth of the matter is, it was just a sort of a correction and a retooling of a statute that I think just gives government too much power. I would like to see a complete blanket prohibition on lockdowns. I don't see any foreseeable circumstance where the government can lock you in your home, just literally lock you in your home through a curfew or essential business work order that says if you're not going to work at the steel plant, you're not allowed to go to a Starbucks or whatever. I just think it's an unconscionable amount of power, and it's not the role of government. So it's a good bill, pragmatic bill, but I think it could have went a little further. Not to bore your audience, but if they're lawyers, they'll know that the bill includes strict scrutiny for any type of strict scrutiny will have to be met for any local government order that's challenged in a court of law if it affects what they call essential functions or important functions like going to church, going to work, certain types of things. So it's a good bill, but I think it could have went a little further.
Yeah, the one that I hear a lot is people ask me why they didn't amend the Florida statute that allows for forced vaccination. Have you heard
Yes,
that?
my bill. I filed a separate bill, House Bill 6003, that would have just stripped the Florida law of this power that the governor has through his health department to mandate vaccines in the state of Florida, just straight up. I mean, they just have this power that says if there's a state of emergency and we think somebody's not vaccinated, they can just restrain them and vaccinate them. That power exists. It's a pretty unconscionable amount of power. The bill, that power came into being right after September 11th, when there was a model statute passed in about half the states in the country that created this new power saying, oh, if there's an emergency, anthrax or whatever, you can just start vaccinating people left and right. It's never been used. Governor DeSantis said he would not use it. But the truth of the matter is, Governor DeSantis won the election by 30,000 votes,
Right.
0.25. I mean, it could have easily been a Democrat in office, and he probably would have used that as an example. I don't know how much he would use it, but he used it enough to scare people into going and getting the vaccine by forcing it upon some individuals. Guaranteed he would have used it. So we need to strip it. It's wrong, and it's sad to see that some of the Republicans in Congress, or I mean, in the legislature, pushed back and killed that bill. That bill never even got a hearing, and the reason is, once again, the lack of courage, fear of challenging the COVID narrative. Too many Republicans were saying, well, I don't want to do anything on vaccinations because I don't want to look crazy and I don't want to be called mean names by the media. So they would just kill a lot of these bills. A lot of good bills died this year. And I think that's another example of it. They killed that bill because they didn't want to be called anti-vax or something like that. And, the power of the media and the left over soft, moderate Republicans is just unfathomable. And the only thing that you can do is just vote these people out and get courageous people who don't mind fighting the narratives. If not, we're going to lose every single time because we're always the bad guy in the narrative. Until you
Right.
challenge the narrative, you're always you're playing defense. I mean, look at a lot of things we're doing right now in the state legislature. Everyone's heralding them, but the truth is they're always defensive moves. It's like we're doing this little thing to defend ourselves from local governments. Like, oh, local governments are allowed to lock me in my home or throw me in jail if I'm not wearing a mask if they can meet strict scrutiny. Like, what a win. It's like, how about just stripping them of that power?
Right.
Uh, it's always like these little defensive moves we're so proud about, and it's not winning. Winning is when you go on offense and you deinstitutionalize the left in the schools and in the universities and in the local governments to make it that freedom can reign without us having to fight or rip the hair out of our heads trying to fight them.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that. Continuing that same sort of maybe medium or long-term optimistic note. One of the other things that I'm seeing right now, and this is because, like because I got in front of this issue and looked around and there was nobody standing behind me, right? And it was just me out there. Uh, I've I get calls from all over the place, right? From people because here they say, well, there's one lawyer who's filing these lawsuits, so they'll call me and I get connected to just the most interesting random people you could imagine. And what I'm seeing, and I want to know if you're seeing this too, is a real groundswell of new local conservative activist groups forming, people who've never been involved in politics before, moms, you name it, and they're all sort of coalescing and starting to talk to each other. Are you seeing the same thing?
No, it's out of control. The biggest positive takeaway, optimistic takeaway, is that so many people who are not political, or maybe even, I mean, I've met people who are actually registered Democrats or NPAs, non-party affiliates, who got so engaged and are now more engaged than ever, and they're actually running for office in local government for school boards and city councils and this kind of stuff because they were so shocked and alarmed by what happened, and also disappointed that the so-called freedom flag waving conservative Republicans, yada yada yada, that always love to talk about freedom and individuals, liberty, literally sat down, did nothing, and let the Fauci narrative win the day. And it wasn't until late in the summer, early fall that Florida even began to fight back, and normalcy didn't return until literally the vaccine came around. And that's just wrong. It's just wrong. So people are shocked and they're more active now than ever. And you're right, it's thousands of people, thousands of people. A lot of the people who were involved in my lawsuits, there were people who reach out to me and say, hey, will you file a lawsuit against my county? I'm the plaintiff or whatever. And I would always tell them, like, I'm a newer lawyer. There are a lot of local lawyers. Once you check on it, nobody would take the cases. So I took
Right.
the case because I said, I'm not going to not let this person file if they asked me. And but those were the same people. It was those newly engaged uh, conservative kind of fighters.
Well, what would you say, given what you've learned as serving as a legislator in Florida now for a few years? What would you say to these grassroots folks for where they need to focus their political pressure right now?
Well, definitely still the school boards. And for decades now, Florida has had pretty bad school boards that are controlled by the unions, controlled by vendors that have contracts with the schools. and controlled just by, the staff who have a lethargy about them and don't really care about, conservative values and proper education and just kind of go with the flow. So I think that they really need to focus their energy on these school boards and all, but also other local offices, city and county commission. I mean, the truth of the matter is we don't have a lot of good run cities, counties, and school boards because most people just simply won't run. They refuse to run. The best citizens in a lot of these communities are just saying, I don't want to do it. I don't want to be attacked and I don't want to, be my name thrown around the media. So I'm not going to run. So all these conservative fighters are now, trying to coalesce their energy in a positive direction. I would tell them to try to run for school boards, city and county commissions. And with a little bit of money and a lot of door knocking, it's so easy to win so many of these counties and cities, especially in like medium-sized counties like Alachua or Lake County, where you can do it.
Yeah. At the state level, you're definitely one of the prominent examples of our legislators that are interested in liberty issues and, sort of traditional constitutional issues. Who are your allies? Who should people be supporting and who should they oppose?
The truth of the matter is it's one of those things where people look at who their reps are and their reps or their senators or their councilmen they always talk conservative. They'll go to the Republican executive committee. They'll do these mailers or TV ads saying they're all these things. And the truth is most of them did a really piss poor job. Why? Because most people traditionally grade politicians based on their voting record. So they'll go to pull their voting record and say, look, I voted for these things. Like, aren't I conservative? Aren't I doing a good job because I voted for these things? But what they're playing on, what they're gaining from in that situation is the public's ignorance of other things they could be doing. So public officials have a duty to enact like Republican conservatives have a duty to enact conservative change and creating pressure to create change, right? To fight in every way they can, not just voting, right? It's like, I voted for this, I voted for this, I voted for this. Like, that's great. That's actually in many ways the least active. It's like the least you can do is showing up to vote. Now we have politicians that literally don't even show up to vote, which I was reading about today. Here, some of our congressmen here in Florida, and that's pretty sad to see. But what I did that made me stick out is I use all my energy in every way I can to fight the narratives and to fight in every way I can. So social media, rallies, could be lawsuits or some other kind of legal action, being involved in legal action. Um, are different ways that you can extend your influence to fight. And a lot of times that means fighting members of your own party, the lethargy of the party. So the state legislature should have called a special session early on and disempowered these local political subdivisions of the enormous power they have. The cities, the counties, and the school boards, especially in the Tri-County area, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami, should have been disempowered very early on. In fact, the governor really should have been removing some of these people from office that were arresting business owners around the state. It was pretty disturbing what was happening. I was writing letters to the governor. I was the only guy writing letters. I was the only one involved in lawsuits. I was the only one doing rallies and trying to fight the narrative and getting on CNN and all this stuff. So to answer your question in a very long way, most have done a really bad job. And, I just tell people, if your Republican congressman's not a true conservative and they weren't fighting the lockdowns from day one, just primary them and get rid of them because they're useless. Because that moment, the COVID moment of the last year, is a black and white issue. It's not ambiguous. It's not complex. And let's just wait and see what the data says. It was a straight up constitutional liberty issue. And for these cowardly Republican elected officials not to have looked that right in the eye and seen that and then reacted accordingly by trying to stop what the government was doing was disturbing and insane. And they should be primary and thrown out of office. So I have a couple allies in the legislature. I have quite a few friends. I have a few allies, but let's be honest, most of the legislature did a really bad job and let this, reign of tyranny occur over the course of a year and the lockdowns to occur. And it was wrong. I think that one of the best elected officials in the state is the governor. The governor is more conservative than most of the members of the legislature, almost all, but just a few. So I would say I give an F to the legislature or maybe a D. And I give the governor, a B plus, or maybe even an A, depending on which month it was. And I'd put it like that. But if they have questions about specific legislators, I'm happy to talk about them. There's
I,
100. there's 160 legislators.
Yeah.
So,
I'm not
but
trying to put you on the spot.
some get really high marks. I mean, like Senator Keith Perry said straight up, anybody that gets fined for wearing a mask, I'll pay for that.
Hmm.
And, he enlisted my help to help a teenage girl who was given a fine of several $100s at the Oaks Mall in Alachua County. Now, later the governor, those fines were waived because of what the governor did. But I mean, some legislators were speaking up and fighting back against the narrative like Keith was, and there was a lot that weren't. They sat back. In fact, they affirmed the narrative, and that was sad. And you got University of Florida right there. What University of Florida did to these kids was
Yeah.
completely disturbing. I represented a kid who was the speaker, the president for Turning Point at his little hearing, um, like kangaroo court hearing on campus after they didn't get a permit to come speak on for one of
Hmm.
their rallies, and it was awful the way they were treated. But there's nothing you can do unless they want to commence a large lawsuit. I don't think the national organization wanted to, but once again, why was the legislature letting that sit back and let these universities bully these conservative kids on campus? It's disgusting. So, I mean, I'm part of a really small minority. Sometimes it's almost one person fighting back against what the legislature is doing, because the state house is so hierarchical that really the speaker and a few people around him make all the shots. And they're
Hmm.
of a very, very moderate establishment, old school kind of appeasement strategy, Republican mindset. And I'm of the opposite. And so that's all I'll say about that.
Is there any chance of a special session to come back and fix some of these problems?
No, no. This legislature is very impotent, very pushed, but laid back. Any credit they get for fighting the COVID narrative and passing conservative legislation really has to go 100% to DeSantis, because I'm telling you right now, if DeSantis wasn't the governor, this legislature would probably still be wearing masks and doing all this nonsense, and not caring about these conservative issues. I mean, this is the same legislature that locked the Capitol during the entire legislative session, going all the way up into the end of March. I'm sorry, the end of April to May 1st. The Capitol was literally locked. The citizens who pay their bills, my bills, all of us, the legislatures, weren't even allowed in the building. And also, they were forcing everyone to wear masks. Out of 160 legislators, I was the only legislator in the entire legislature not to wear a mask. Right. And this is after the vaccine. This is months into the vaccine being 100% accessible. Locked doors, masks, social distancing, etc. So no, Governor DeSantis deserves all the credit for the good conservative stuff that happened. The legislature was bad. We got more rhinos in the state legislature than the San Diego Zoo, is what I like to say. It's pretty pathetic.
Okay, so it sounds like that's one area where we need the folks to focus is on helping real conservatives get into office at the state level. And, obviously the federal level, everybody already pays attention to that. But then you're saying also at the local level and just hit all those different offices and get the right people in, right?
Yes. At the federal level, the only thing that could have really been done is they should have made it that the bailout money, the checks they were sending out, were contingent upon states not having lockdowns. So they should have put something in the federal legislation that says, hey, you get your money if your state is open. If you're continuing the lockdown, no money will go to your state. But at the state level, and a lot of people don't know this, at the state level, the state legislative level, we had all the power. We still have all the power. All the cities, counties, and school boards are completely under the control of the state legislature. They have unlimited authority to dictate what they do. And the states had all the power during COVID. And the state legislature gets an F. It failed miserably. It allowed a false narrative to move forward, and allowed a lot of tyranny and ridiculousness occur throughout the state for a long time. So that's where people's energy needs to be, making sure that you get good, liberty-minded, constitutional conservatives elected in the state house and state senate.
Okay, I'll definitely pass that along, and I want to be respectful to your time. We're at about the 30-minute mark, so let me just finish up with a couple questions we ask all of our guests here. Well, first of all, what are you looking forward to doing the most now that things are opening up?
Well, I was lucky enough to live in Lake County, where we kind of my county ignored all the lockdowns and mask mandates and everything else. So nothing really closed. If it did, it was for a really short period of time, and things are back to normal and great. Uh, I love to travel. I love to eat out at good restaurants. And I was lucky enough to live in a state where the restaurants open quick and the bars kind of quick. So, going around the state, taking some nice trips with my wife. I remember I'm running for Congress right now, actually, for the new congressional seat that Florida was awarded because of population growth, which will be in Central Florida. And so I'm running for this new seat and traveling all around the state today. I'll be in Brevard. So to answer your question, just doing what I'm doing, which is traveling and enjoying this amazing, beautiful free state.
Do you have a website up for your new run?
Yeah, sabatiniforcongress.com. That's the website.
Okay, we'll make sure to put that in the description too. What's your favorite kind of coffee?
So I'm a huge coffee drinker, as you can tell. I've been sipping this the whole time. And that is a bad habit I picked up from my days at University of Florida, drinking way too much coffee. But I like African blends, like Kenyan sun-washed coffees. I like a lot of acid in my coffee and bright flavored coffees. So that's usually what I like, lighter to medium blends.
Are you a coffee pot man or a K-cup man?
Oh, I hate K-cups. I think it's the worst development in the history of coffee because it's dry frozen, but no judgment if you use them. I do my own French press, but also use a Mr. Coffee if I have to drink a lot of coffee throughout the day.
I see. Well, thank you very much for sharing that with us. We're going to be rooting for you and supporting you any way we can. And I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate you having me on. Looking forward to talking again. Take care.
You bet. Keep up the good work.